Hey everybody, let's talk Portuguese. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about why Portuguese and Spanish are different languages. Now, there are a million videos comparing Portuguese and Spanish with things like vocabulary and other curiosities on YouTube. This is not going to be yet another one of those because I'm not here to teach you Portuguese or Spanish, but I would like to take a linguistics-focused look at what makes Portuguese and Spanish different. One of the most basic and obvious ways that we can tell if two languages are different is if there is intelligibility between them. Intelligibility is a linguistics term referring to the ability of speakers to understand something. Mutual intelligibility is the ability of speakers of two linguistic varieties to understand one another when they're speaking in their respective varieties. And in the case of Portuguese and Spanish, we have what is known as asymmetric intelligibility, which is when speakers of one linguistic variety have an easier time of understanding and communicating with speakers of another linguistic variety than the other way around. This is to say that although Portuguese and Spanish are very similar, mutual intelligibility between the two is not guaranteed. And when we think about the asymmetric intelligibility between Portuguese and Spanish, what we're referring to is the relative ease that Portuguese speakers have of understanding and communicating with Spanish speakers and not the other way around. And indeed, Portuguese and Spanish are very similar languages. They share quite a number of syntactic and other grammatical features, as well as a wide base of lexicon that they have in common that was inherited from Latin. But the superficial similarities between Portuguese and Spanish can also be deceptive. The similarity in form, whether that be grammatical structures or even lexicon, can complicate the assimilation of different patterns of use in the other language. This refers to things like getting grammatical peculiarities between one or the other language separated and right consistently and fluently by the standards of either language for a native speaker of one or the other. Portuguese and Spanish grammar are very similar, but they have some notable distinctions between them. Portuguese and Spanish, although they share quite a lot of vocabulary with very minor differences between them related to systematic changes over time, also have quite a number of false friends between them. Speakers of one or the other language will often use words that are native to their language when they're attempting to speak the other language because they assume that the vocabulary is similar enough, and so they will simply be understood. This is what we call a relatively low barrier to communication. A barrier to communication is something that impedes two speakers of linguistic varieties from communicating with one another. And this can result in what is known as portunhol. Portunhol is what happens when speakers of Portuguese and Spanish combine the two together in a spontaneous but not systematized way in order to communicate amongst themselves. Speakers will often use their native language's words in the grammar of the other language, or they will change a little bit about their pronunciation, or they will simply add words from their native language into their attempt at speaking the other, and the end result is portunhol. What I mean is that portunhol is a spontaneous occurrence. It doesn't have any systematized features that always happen every time you hear it, because if it did, it would constitute a pidgin language. And although there is a vernacular form of Portuguese that is heavily influenced by Spanish, spoken on the Uruguayan-Brazilian border, that sometimes is called portunhol by its speakers, that is indeed not the totality of what we know as portunhol in general. So the low barrier to communication that results in portunhol is often the roadblock that leads to Spanish or Portuguese speakers not attaining a high level fluency in the other language. But you might be thinking to yourself that mutual intelligibility is not the complete picture when we think about the distinction between one language and another, or what constitutes a language as opposed to a dialect. As a matter of fact, in linguistics, the question of what is a language is not a very well resolved question at all. There are no hard, fast, or concrete rules in linguistics that govern what is considered a language and what is considered a dialect, and often you will hear the term linguistic variety as a way of avoiding either term. This is because what defines a language or a dialect is very often a political and cultural issue, and not actually all that relevant to the science of language and how it works. I've touched touched a little bit on this topic in a video that I did about Galician and its relationship to Portuguese, because indeed Galician and Portuguese share a common ancestor, and the question of whether Galician and Portuguese constitute separate languages or simply dialects of the same language is a pretty hotly debated political and cultural topic. But Portuguese and Spanish are fairly uncontroversially considered separate languages. Now, we have to bear in mind that the Romance languages that we know of today all stem from Latin, and they stem from what was known as Vulgar Latin. Vulgar Latin is the Latin that was used by the people who spoke it across the former territory of the Roman Empire. But suffice it to say that Portuguese and Spanish occupy different points on the Latin dialect continuum. A dialect continuum is basically like a gradient range between linguistic varieties that all share a common origin or could all be branched together as the same language. And if we think back to what we were talking about mutual intelligibility, two different linguistic varieties at far ends of a dialect continuum can lack that mutual intelligibility, but sometimes still be grouped together as the same language. So mutual intelligibility itself isn't the entire picture. What we get with a dialect continuum is simply the observation of systematic differences between different points along that spectrum. What that means is that speakers of different linguistic varieties along that continuum will have systematized different changes and features of that linguistic variety, making it distinct from other linguistic varieties along that continuum. Generally speaking, this results in areas between these different dialectal points on the continuum where speakers have a sort of mixed speech, where they're speaking dialects of transition. Those dialects of transition often look a lot like the border Portuguese spoken that is sometimes called Portuñol along the Uruguayan and Brazilian border. But if we're thinking about the Romance languages more generally, and we're thinking about the Iberian Romance languages, we have in fact a very clearly drawn spectrum. Between Portuguese and Spanish, we have what is known as Astur-Leonese. Generally, historically, this language served as sort of the intermediary between Spanish and Portuguese. It shared many features in common with both. But due to the political history of how Spain and Portugal came to be, Astur-Leonese has largely died out. And this is very much the case with most Romance languages today. We're not popularly inclined to see the Romance languages as a spectrum or as a continuum, because we really tend to think of the Romance languages along the terms of the national Romance languages. Portuguese is pretty different to Spanish, which is even more different to Italian or French. But in reality, there is a greater transition of regional dialects and languages between all of them. Those regional dialects and languages have largely died out in the modern era, and in contemporary times there are a more limited number of speakers of regional languages and dialects. This is especially true in France, which all but eliminated the regional languages that it once had, which include languages like Occitan, but it is also true to a lesser extent of Spain, which successfully eliminated or marginalized many of its regional languages. Astur-Leonese is one of them. It has relatively few speakers left and a limited amount of legal and official recognition in its historical range. Asturian has limited but formal recognition in Asturias. Portugal gives full recognition of the Mirandese language, which is an Astur-Leonese variety, but Mirandese has a very limited number of speakers, and most of its speakers are elderly. So we now have a clearer picture that there once existed a smoother transition between Portuguese and Spanish. But we also have to stop and consider that Spanish and Portuguese also did historically develop separately. Aside from the political and cultural reasons why we consider Spanish and Portuguese to be different languages, they have been separately systematized in their historical development from Vulgar Latin. Although many of the ways that Spanish and Portuguese systematically changed over time were in parallel or very similar, there are some crucial differences that even early on made themselves readily apparent. The medieval distinctions that related to the s and z and ch and sh sounds, and were pretty much the same between both of them during that period, would go on to change very dramatically in both in very different ways in the early modern period. This is also one of the factors that explains differences in Portuguese and Spanish orthography. And this is to say nothing, of course, of the small but notable differences between Portuguese and Spanish grammar that have meaningful impacts on the way speakers express themselves in one or the other language. And this gets us into more of the political and cultural reasons why Spanish and Portuguese developed on their own, as opposed to some medieval prestige variety emerging that housed simply speakers from either area in separate dialects of the same language. Spain, or more accurately put Castile, and Portugal consolidated as nations about 800 years ago. And this coincides with when the Romance languages, as we think of them in their modern forms, have all tended to kind of consolidate and become the modern Romance languages. Indeed, the earliest literary works published in both Spanish and Portuguese began to appear in the early 1200s. And by the 1200s, both languages were already showing many of the characteristic signs of the changes that they had undergone to become each respective language. Portugal and Castile, as separate kingdoms, had separate ambitions both economically and politically. Now, often these ambitions were in parallel to one another, including things like colonization and exploration abroad. But they were often in direct competition with one another as well. And this even included during the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula in the period known as the Reconquista. The Christian kingdoms of Portugal and what would then become known as Spain conquered the territory of the Iberian Peninsula during the period of the Reconquista from the Muslim caliphates that were existent in it during several hundreds of years. Something interesting to note is that historically, local populations did not necessarily have that great of an incentive to change the language that they would use unless a conquering nation were to come and either directly tie that region into its economic sphere, or they were to repopulate that area with people from within that nation. So the linguistic situation of the Iberian Peninsula was one where the local Latin variety known as Mozarabic was continually spoken. Arabic did not supplant Mozarabic, but in fact simply influenced the Latin variety spoken. This is why we have so many loan words and place names in both Portugal and Spain that have an Arabic origin. And Mozarabic was very similar to both Portuguese and Spanish as well. So when Portugal and Spain were gaining territories toward the south, they were also embarking on a repopulation effort in order to make those territories Christian. And of course, these efforts to populate these areas with Christian and to get local populations to convert back to Christianity had the effect of taking the linguistic varieties with them. This is the main reason why Spanish and Portuguese consolidated the way they did the further south you go in their respective territories. Mozarabic speakers were, quite simply put, assimilated into Portuguese and Spanish as they had previously been developing in the north. This also explains why we don't have a Southern Iberian modern Romance language that is distinct from Spanish or Portuguese. And this cultural history shaped national identities and linguistic attitudes, contributing to the greater consolidation in the early modern period of national linguistic varieties. The early modern period, by around the end of the Reconquista, is also around the same time when national languages began to be seen as tools of empire. And so it is that Portuguese and Spanish speakers have historically, culturally, and politically seen themselves as distinct and separate. But Portugal and Spain weren't always so separate. There was indeed a period known as the Iberian Union in which the crowns of Portugal and Spain were combined but not fused between 1580 and 1640. For a couple hundred years in Portugal, there was what was known as literary bilingualism in Portugal among the aristocracy and nobility. This period of bilingualism ended with the restoration of the Portuguese crown as an independent kingdom. But for the period of a couple hundred years, many of the Portuguese aristocracy were fluent in both Portuguese and Spanish, and indeed, in the early modern period, many of the most influential writers were writing in both Portuguese and Spanish. This has a number of reasons to it. One of them is the presence of Spaniards in the Portuguese court and aristocracy at large through things like marriages. And the other part of it is the existence of two prestige universities in both Portugal and Spain. The universities of Coimbra and Salamanca are two of the oldest continually operating universities in the world. And the University of Salamanca historically was no less important to the Portuguese learned classes than the University of Coimbra. Often the Portuguese would go to Salamanca in order to do their studies and learn their professions in order to be of service to the Portuguese crown. But we have no verifiable records of there being widespread bilingualism among the general population or the lower classes in Portugal during that time. So we have a limited amount of influence of Spanish on Portuguese as a result. There are a number of loanwords in Portuguese from Spanish from that period, but there doesn't appear to have been a lasting influence from Spanish on Portuguese otherwise. And the history and rivalry between both countries is something that is historically quite strong and certainly not going away anytime soon, even in our modern contemporary period. Even things like the mythology of national origin are somewhat different between both countries. Portugal, for its part, draws quite heavily on the pre-Roman Lusitanians, and indeed the Roman province covering most of what is now known as Portugal was called Lusitania, to such an extent that even to this day, terms like Lusitano and Luso are references to Portugal specifically. This is in contrast with Spain, which is a country that has a history of consolidating around territorial conquests. The founding nation, so to speak, of Spain itself that led the charge in the consolidation of Spain as Spain gets its name from the numerous castle fortifications that existed in its territory, used by the Castilians as they were gaining territory from the Muslims. So in all of this, we can see that there are a number of linguistic and cultural reasons why Portuguese and Spanish, although they are so similar, are still considered different languages and not just dialects of one same language. So that's all I've got for what makes Portuguese and Spanish different languages. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like me to make more videos exploring the differences between Spanish and Portuguese, or you have a question about any of the topics that I discussed in today's video, leave me a comment down below. So that's all I've got for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you learned something or otherwise found it interesting, leave me a thumbs up down below. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you're not already. I make lots of videos about the Portuguese language, which you can find directly on my channel or in the eye above, and I will see you next time.